Good evening, everyone. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. We appreciate you not going outside for the nice weather for the local crowd, and for being here tonight for the last Tocqueville lecture of the 2022-2023 year. The Tocqueville lecture series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born in the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as it relates to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free lectures are open to the public. We welcome the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The Alabama Humanities Alliance exists to provide context, build empathy, and make the state of Alabama a more vibrant place to live, all through humanities. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Jonathan Marks. He's a professor of political science at Ursinus College. He is a three-time graduate of the University of Chicago, having earned his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD from the university. He's previously taught at James Madison College, at Michigan State University, and Carthage College. He's also the author of several wonderful articles that have appeared in journals such as the American Science Review, Journal of Politics, Journal of American Science, and the Review of Politics. In addition, he has authored books such as The Perfection and Disharmony in the Thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a book I'm partial to, helping get through my dissertation, and the more recent, Let's Be Reasonable, a conservative case for liberal education, which speaks to my love of John Locke and reason in that book. In addition, he publishes through the public outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Chronicle Power of Education, and Commentary Magazine. Tonight, he's here to present on the topic free speech on campus, which the campus of Jacksonville State University will continue to explore next fall with the American Democracy Project, as it is hosting a free speech forum. I will share more information about the event later tonight after the Q&A, but please stay tuned as this promises to be a very exciting event this fall. It's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Jonathan Marks.
Professor Gross. I've heard myself described as a three-time graduate of the University of Chicago. I'm not sure it's a good thing. I feel like I have to defend myself. I didn't go to the University of Chicago Latin high school. that's what the real lifers do. I'm not one of those. I'm really happy to be here at Jack State. Originally, I was going to say Jacksonville State, but I read that you had a brand refresh. so congratulations. Let me start by saying something about the scope of all this. We're at a state university, so I guess it's appropriate to talk about free speech, the First Amendment kind of way. That includes provision that Congress will make no law abridging of freedom of speech, but it applies to Alabama. The Supreme Court has held by the post-Civil War 14th Amendment, state universities are instruments of the state. So state universities are stuck with it too, that they can't do things like have vague, broad scoped kinds of speech codes. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. Private universities like Ursinus, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. Ursinus, our mascot. He said, after your mascot's the bears, you just said and Ursinus problem, and you know how to pronounce it. We too need a brand refresh. But we're not subject to the First Amendment, so we can suppress speech all we want. But like a lot of other private universities, we make some guarantees in our student handbook and in our faculty handbook, which could become the basis of a lawsuit. That's true of many private universities. So we'll talk some about that kind of First Amendment thing, but usually that's actually not what people are talking about when they're talking about free speech on campus. They mean something more like, are universities the kinds of places where free exchange of ideas is likely to happen? That's not really a First Amendment question. In fact, at times, I can make it pretty difficult to exchange ideas by using my First Amendment rights. And anyone who's spent a moment or two on social media knows this to be true. It's more a question of free speech acts. It's a question of First Amendment. How good are conditions for exchanging ideas on our campuses? Finally, scope-wise, there's what's called academic freedom, which is recognized by courts sometimes, but academic freedom, more than a legal doctrine, is a set of practices that most nonprofit universities adopted voluntarily. These protect professors as they write and teach, and students as they learn from undue interference from college presidents, boards of trustees, legislators, and others who have power over universities and might not like very much what's being said there. If universities are to be intellectual experiment stations, so the argument goes, and those powerful figures need to exercise a lot of restraint when it comes to teaching, learning, scholarship, and even what professors say when they're off the job. That's why, for example, universities usually honor tenure, which makes it very hard. To fire a professor once that professor has successfully passed a number of reviews. Congratulations, Dr. Gross. To apply this to speech, it's typically much more difficult to fire a tenured professor over political social media posts than it is to fire, say, an employee of Google. So that's going to be part of our subject too. Most of this talk is about the threat environment for free speech on campus. Is there some claim of free speech crisis? And I'm mostly going to look at three areas: speaker disinvitations, student opinion, and recent activity in state legislatures. And I'm happy to think about others in the Q&A. And I'll conclude the talk by considering why free speech all by itself, it isn't enough to help colleges and universities think about and work out their missions. So is there a free speech crisis on campus? One reason to think that there might be is that our free speech rights seem more extensive off campus than they are on campus. I get the next slide. So on March 10th, 2006, Lieutenant Corporal Matthew Snyder, who died in an accident while serving in Iraq, was laid to rest. Picketers from the Westboro Baptist Church stood about 1,000 feet away, out of sight but nearby. They held signs. Some included a familiar anti-gay epithet, one depicted stick fingers having anal sex. Another sign said, "You're going to hell, God hates you, thank God for 9/11, God hates the USA." The Westboro Baptist Church believes that God hates the United States for tolerating homosexuality. The jury later awarded Matthew's father $10.9 million, in part for the infliction of emotional distress. You, I think, deserve to break less than this Westboro crew. In 2011, they had threatened to picket the funeral of a 9-year-old shooting victim. But the Supreme Court in Snyder v. Phelps said the jury got it wrong. Westboro's words inflicted great pain when they were displayed in a public place on a matter of public concern, and therefore were entitled to the highest degree of First Amendment protection. In an 8-1 decision, the liberal and conservative wings of the court agreed that even fathers of fallen soldiers must tolerate even hateful speech. Colleges and universities are often less demanding. Over at Troy University, I thought there was a rivalry, so I left some space here for booing, but I don't know, so not really. Over at Troy University, and I got a little bit, yeah. Insensitive language, whatever that means, is considered a serious violation of housing policy. That's their handbook. Happily, another Alabama university has gotten rid of the part of its conduct code that forbade students to offend anybody on university property. That university, I would have at the time called the Jacksonville States, prior to the grand refresh. Close to home, at Lafayette College, students, according to the code of conduct, that's in Pennsylvania, that's where I'm from, according to the code of conduct, must not cause emotional harm to others. That's part of their handbook. And what is that? For example, if I feel under active threat, or I think a KKK rally is happening on campus, it sounds like I'm probably experiencing emotional harm, but I'm quoting student reactions to pro-Donald Trump shopping, not on that campus, but on another campus. So what does it mean to say that cannot inflict emotional harm on others on campus. So in that way, there's a disconnect between the world inside certain colleges and universities, which are trying to protect students from offensive speech, and the world outside of those colleges and universities, where Mr. Snyder is told, we sympathize, we're sorry, the law provides you no relief. This disconnect has captured the attention of media organizations like the New York Times, which has an op-ed on this very subject today, and the Washington Post, but the conservative media have made a specialty of highlighting the suppression of conservative speech on campus. I'll get to the next slide. It's already there. Consider campus reform. Founded in 2009, campus reform is a project of the Leadership Institute, which trains conservative activists. And if you follow it on Twitter, as I do, you can go to bed at 11 o'clock, wake up at 6, ready for your day of rage tweeting. And campus reform will have 5 stories stacked on your feed. California College compares conservative group to Hitler. That's a typical tweet. If you click through, which the last I did, one student of 13,000 at Santa Barbara City College should make something like that comparison. Now, not all of campus reform stories are like that. Colleges and universities supply ample criticism for fair criticism. But when a University of North Texas undergraduate reflects on manspreading, campus reform is there. When a Princeton University freshman complains that other people make fun of the way he pronounces school web, describes as microaggression, campus reform is there. Maybe your communications office produced a sleepy newsletter about how some people take offense at the phrase "okay, boomer," while others do not. Stop the presses. Campus reform is there. Well, so what? Campus reform has a lot more Twitter followers than conservative magazines like Commentary and the Bulwark. It has about half as many as National Review, and their stories get picked up. OK Boomer made the Daily Wire and was shared on Ben Shapiro's Facebook page, which last I checked is closing in on 9 million followers. If campus reform reporters strike gold and collect 20 signatures on an anti-Christmas petition, I get the next slide. That's going to be Fox News worthy. So a lot of potential to reach a very large audience with these stories. So why produce them? Why produce an avalanche of anecdotes, the effect of which is to exaggerate for a large audience the sins of higher education? Well, before the electoral point became moot, campus reform let it all hang out in a fundraising appeal. Conservative students face constant abuse from their peers, their grades get docked by leftist professors, their rights get violated by spineless school administrators. This is still America, isn't it? Didn't we elect Donald Trump? The best-selling conservative author, Heather McDonald, has spoken of a free speech totalitarian crisis on our campus. Such exaggerations make it easy to wave away concerns about free speech on campus. Can I get the next one? That's waving away. That's a mistake, but what do we know about what's going on? Test reflexes. Can I get the next one? Not very much, less than we think. And so I'm going to start off with dissertations. That's part one. Earlier this month at Stanford Law School, federal judge Al Duncan was invited to speak by a conservative student group, Federalist Society. How many of you already know about this case? So a couple. Stanford has been trending on Twitter just about every day for the past 3 weeks. It's happened three weeks ago. So it's been kind of a big story. Some students objected to, among other things, Judge Duncan's opposition to same-sex marriage and his stance on transgender issues. Oh, it's already up there. Okay. Students showed their displeasure by putting up posters with headshots of Federalist Society student leaders, along with their names and class years, said, "Meet the Federalist Society's 2022-23 board, you should be ashamed." So far, there's really no free speech problem there. In fact, I think that is free speech. Such posters are free speech, but it does indicate something about the cost of inviting certain speakers, even inviting a federal judge, however controversial, to a law school. Stanford, citing its policies on free speech, said, well, his lecture is going to go on anyway, despite the protests. So Judge Duncan came to campus, and his speech attracted protesters in considerably greater numbers than it attracted students there. Reportedly, 100 or so protesters booed audience members as they entered. They shouted at Duncan as he entered. A According to Duncan, one of the Federalist Society students, one yelled, "We hope your daughters get raised." Inside the event, students carried signs, substantive, and vulgar. There's a vulgar one up there. Again, still within the bounds of free speech. What happened next, though, probably at least violated Stanford's own policies, which forbid students, faculty, and staff members from disrupting the effective carrying out of university function, including a lecture. Both the students introducing Duncan and Duncan himself were extensively, continually heckled. As Duncan began to speak, students shouted things like, "You couldn't get into Stanford. Sorry. You're not welcome here. We hate you. Why do you hate Black people? You never come back. We hate Fed-Soc students. F them." This is a family talk. That's not exactly what he said, something like that. Administrators, though they had advanced warning of protest, did nothing to intervene or remind students of what Stanford's policy was regarding event disruptions. Eventually, an administrator from Stanford's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office did get up and gave a prepared speech in which she said, "Yeah, I think you should allow Duncan to speak," but the rest of the speech was taken up explaining why she thought maybe Duncan's presence there wasn't really worth it. More or less sided with the protesters and never mentioned again that they're actually violating Stanford's policy on disruption of events. So Duncan gave up trying to give a speech, and he'd been shouting down at this point for maybe 15 minutes, and went directly to a contentious Q&A, which ended well before the event was supposed to, when Duncan had enough of the nasty back and forth, in which the students, and frankly, Duncan himself, behaved pretty badly, at one point calling some of the professors juvenile idiots. "What are you, 14? He said to one of the protesters, just the one actually carrying this sign. Student answered back, "What are you, 91? So that was the character of this exchange. Although there was still some shouting and interrupting on the part of the students, Duncan did have a chance to respond to questions, but in fact responded to some quite dismissive. Now, I would think anyone, even a judge, would be pretty flustered and angry about what happened, but still I think it's fair to say that Duncan was a fool. How badly his Q&A session went. Nonetheless, the students who shouting did derail Duncan's remarks violate Stanford's policies, and the president of Stanford and dean of the law school have apologized, conceded the violation, and admitted that staff president failed to enforce the policy and intervened in an inappropriate way. Next one. As often happens after these events, conservatives are making much of it, and left-wingers are digging in. Stanford's apology has itself been protected. As I mentioned, Stanford has been trending on Twitter probably for the past 3 weeks quite regularly. It's the lead story in Campus Report right now, 3 weeks later. All right, that's one disruption of one university. And I can point you to others, but our speakers often prevent them from speaking. Few students and others often even attempt to stop them from speaking. Attempts to get speakers disinvited or to disrupt their speeches have been up, it seems. Get the next one. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, with its great acronym FIRE, tracks such attempts, reports of which have trended FIRE since FIRE started keeping track. But in absolute terms, you can see there aren't many. There are over 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. A lot of them invite speakers. Again, in 2016, which was a record year, FIRE reported 43 incidents in its disinvitation database. Remember that these are only attempts. They're not successful suppression of speech. And the database includes both actual disruptions, like that shout down that I was just talking about, but also online petitions, which aren't that hard to carry off. So you could argue that 43 is not that many, maybe less than you'd expect. Still, the more such incidents there are, the more one invites only speakers, to borrow something the writer Caitlin Flanagan has said about campus comedians, who promised that if the most hypersensitive weirdo on campus mistakenly wandered in, the words he would hear would fall on him like a soft rain. You know, who wants to take additional security precautions and worry that their plans are going to be dashed? Your best bet is to invite somebody obscure, no one has heard of, somebody bland. And that's how I get most of my speaking invitations, so I'm not going to knock. But I also arrange a lot of talks, and one consideration anyone who arranges talks is likely to have in mind is my talk going to attract protesters? Why? Because protests are, a pain. I'm not saying they're not necessary, but if you're organizing a speech, they're a pain. They can spoil an event in which you invested a lot of time and a lot of money. And maybe, as happened to folks over at Rhodes College who invited the philosopher Peter Singer to speak, you'll be accused of indifference to the well-being of vulnerable students because Singer is a villain to many disability rights activists. So who wants to risk that? And who wants to risk generating negative publicity for the college? So you could argue that though there are only these 43 attempts, they may stand in for a lot more decisions not to invite controversial speakers. It's hard to say, right? Because the costs of doing are so high, though, you might expect that there are a lot of those instances. That's one reason we know less than we'd like to know about this. Now, student groups tend to be less sensitive to these considerations, and so they'll invite speakers like Nesta Souza or Ben Shapiro, who for $20,000 or $30,000 will stand behind the podium at Stanford or Yale and talk about how they're not allowed to speak. Often these speakers draw protests. Sometimes they draw even violent protests, but they also draw crowds, and they're usually heard. I think they're heard, considerably more often than not. Even so, where faculty fear controversy and students are inviting speakers primarily to own the libs, we probably aren't living our best campus free speech lives. Now, I said, less than we'd like, and as much as I love FIRE's dissertation database, would recommend going and coming through it. It's a lot of fun. That's true dissertations. We just don't know a lot. The database is compiled by scanning the news, right? There's some guy there. There's some gal who's scanning the news, looking at cases fitted to FIRE at some other organizations and entering them in. So there are a lot more incidents reported, from 2002 coming up to around 2016. But what does that reflect, right? Does it reflect an actual increase in incidents? Does it reflect an increased journalistic interest in incidents? Or does it increase FIRE's growing notoriety so that people are more likely to tell them about such things? We simply don't know. I suspect there has been a genuine increase in incidents, but there's, I'd say no way of knowing from the database. Even the number of attempted dissertations doesn't tell you that much. So in 2016, that record here, a single speaker, Milo was alone, accounted for a quarter of all attempts that year, a quarter of all. 2005, when there were a lot of dissertation attempts, more than usual, coming in from the right of the speaker, a single speaker, Ward Churchill, accounted for more than half of those attempts. In 2022, Matt Walsh, I don't remember his name, that's it, Matt Walsh, best known for his documentary, What is a Woman, accounted for 16% of all dissertation attempts that year. So even if you got a high raw number, it might not reflect some broad trend, but the notoriety of particular speaker. So again, hard to know. After 2018, right, this is a big dip. In 2018, Jeffrey Sachs, the political scientist, and lots of others, including me, said, see, now it looks like they've stopped. Yeah, 2019, at 40 attempts, was pretty close to a record year. Did we eat our words at that point? Well, I started to. But before I could swallow, Sachs pointed out, can you get the next slide? So this one distinguishes from attempts from the left, attempts from the right in blue, and attempts that they couldn't classify in gray. And what you see in 2018, even the number is pretty high, that attempts from the left are nowhere near, right? I'm sorry, 2019 when it goes up, attempts from the left are still nowhere near their peak. What happens in 2019 is attempts from the right actually go up a bit. Yeah? So what Sachs said is, everybody's talking about attempts from the left to suppress speech. Yeah, they went up. But in comparison to prior years, they're not actually up when it comes to the attempts people seem most concerned about, which is attempts coming from the left to suppress conservative speakers. Is that a trend? Was it now going to be the case that conservatives would start shutting down more speech? Well, 2020, Nathan Dewar said no, not exactly. So yeah, actually more previous years. So again, it's very hard to know, I think, just what's going on. Finally, dissertation attempts, while they may be a pretty good barometer of free speech on campus, aren't the only one. And if FIRE were reporting emails and phone calls demanding that a professor be fired, I bet the conservative media organizations that Tucker Carlson's campus craziness segments generate more of those than comparable effort coming from the left. Okay, so that's dissertations. And I don't know, sort of. The answer to the question is there a crisis with respect to those? Part two is student opinion. So let's turn to kids today, yeah, whose willingness to curtail expression is worried free speech advocates. That worry is backed by some survey data, a 2017 Cato survey. Can I get the next one? It's striking for two reasons. First, it's not about college administrators suppressing speech. It's about what the government should do to stop constitutionally protected speech. Respondents in college and graduate school at the time of the survey tended more than non-students to support that. The government should, in violation of the First Amendment, I think it's quite clear violation of the First Amendment, should go out and suppress certain kinds of speech. Second, can I get the next slide? This finding held across most categories of offensive speech, right? Both speech that might be offensive both offensive might be offensive to the left and speech that might be offensive to the right. If you were young and in college at the time, you tended more than the group who was not in college at the time to think, yes, there ought to be a law preventing people from saying insulting stuff in public about all of these different groups. The trend was in the same direction for nearly every category. It was small in some cases, but in the same direction. Right? So people took that survey and said, well, there seems to be something going on with what young people think about speech. But can I get the next slide? It's complicated. Can I get the next one now? Same Cato survey finds a whopping 69% of students saying that freedom of speech ensures the truth ultimately win out. Right now, I'm a pretty big free speech guy, and even I don't really believe that. So it's quite striking that this survey, which shows this worrying to free speech advocate stuff, also shows that kind of thing. A 2016 Knight Foundation survey compared students 18 to 24 to a sample of adults 18 or over. So again, this is a comparison here to people college age and college people who aren't. One question the survey asked, and I'm condensing, is should colleges create an open learning environment where students are exposed to all kinds of speech and viewpoints, even if that means allowing offensive or biased speech? Or should students create a positive learning environment for all students by prohibiting certain biased or offensive speech? Of the two samples, the one consisting only of students was more, not less likely to choose an open environment. Considerably more, and not less likely to choose an open environment. Can I get the next slide? So this was not a fluke. In 2017 and 2019, the Knight Foundation asked a similar question, not exactly the same, but similar, and got a similar answer. Overwhelming student majorities choosing an open learning environment. In 2021, the Knight Foundation asked one more time. They changed it up a little bit again and said, we'll give you a sort of I don't know choice, let you not choose. And that did erode, right, a pretty good chunk of the people who choose open before. But nonetheless, people who want the open environment still represent well over double people who chose the other option. Now, if you believe in what you read in campus reports say about what students think about speech, this is a surprising result, right? So that's one way in which it's complicated. The survey commissioned by FIRE, love that acronym, found. Can I get the next slide? Oh, it's already there. So fast. A majority of student respondents agreeing that colleges and universities shouldn't be able to restrict student expression of political views that are hurtful or offensive to certain students, right? A majority, and this holds for Democrats, Republicans, and independents, also agree that it is important to be part of a campus community where I am not exposed to intolerant or offensive ideas. Again, for people who kind of free speech stands, that tends to worry them. On the other hand, same survey, healthy majorities of all political persuasions agreed that students should have the right to free speech on campus, even if what they're saying will offend others, right? If you compare the first to the third, and you sort of, right? I mean, what's going on there exactly? And in the teeth of, right, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, this was taken not much long after that, a majority agreed that white nationalists had a right to protest peacefully, should be allowed to do it. So students are clearly of two minds about restricting campus speech. I certainly find this when I teach classes, right, that involve free speech. Sometimes they're gay, let's invite the Nazi, and sometimes they're no, don't let that professor talk about something that seems pretty innocuous compared to inviting a Nazi, right? What's the context, what's the day, what are you reading? So these surveys are snapshots, and that question of wording matters. And again, it's hard to tell what's going on. Year two, we don't know much. When it comes to free speech on campus, we rarely ask students the same questions twice, much less over and over, year in and year out, with the same words. Even when we do that, we don't always get clear trends. Look at the next one. This is the Freedom Forum survey, and it's asking the question, does the First Amendment go too far? What you can see is it jumps all over the place, right? In response to events. So, 2002, that's probably September 11th, right? A lot more people think the First Amendment went too far. The other peak might have something to do with the Boston Marathon bombing. But my point is that you see people looking at these other surveys, like the fire surveys, and looking at small increases or decreases, try to gauge, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And they're much smaller than the kind of increases and decreases that are going on in this survey, which is sort of flipping all over the place. So it's hard to get, sort of trend lines that you feel like you can rely on. There is one survey, the Higher Education Research Institute freshman survey. So if you have taken this, that's asked the same question repeatedly from large student samples, over 95,000 in 2019. This is a big sample of incoming first-year students. 2019 is the most recent year. Can I get the next slide? At least, they've asked this in 2019, but it's the most recent year for which they've written reports. One question they asked, to what extent students agree that students have a right to banish student speakers. It starts off at 37.2% agreement in 1967. Agreement sticks between 20 and 25% from 1972 to 1986. That's one of the World Series. And when everybody seems to have stopped asking this question for a while, perhaps they were celebrating. But when they started asking again in 2004, you can really see that things have changed somehow. Agreement is now in the low 40s, where it remained for a long time, quite recently, where it climbed to a little over 50%. We started at 37.2% long ago. We're up, I think, a hair over 50% now. That does seem like a change, right? It's hard to know when it happened and how it happened because there's a big gap. I stopped asking the question for a while. So who knows? I do think it represents a real change. They are asking the same question in the same way, right? So lots of people. So something is going on. We'll go about that particular question in 2 minutes. Part 3, state legislatures. So let me now turn to that. This is the area in which the most has changed since I started really writing about this issue. Back in 2020, I was completing a draft of a book, and I said with a straight face at the time, politicians mostly don't try to meddle in the classroom. Yes, I did say that. I'm also the person who said that Starbucks would never make it in New York, so never trust anything I say about what's likely to happen in the future. Now, I was aware that in 2014 in South Carolina, legislators had cut off some funding to 2 state universities for assigning Fun Home, a coming-of-age memoir authored by a Western incoming freshman. But that kind of action involving only $69,000 seemed more the exception than the rule at the time to me. I was also aware that President Trump had issued this executive order in 2019 that many faculty members thought was an encroachment on the independence of universities. But although there was some reason, I think, to worry about how the order would be implemented, for sure, all the order really said was that state universities had to stick to their First Amendment obligations, which they're already obliged to stick to. And that private universities had to stick to whatever guarantees they already offer. Right? So basically, they were saying, if you don't do that, we're going to get involved. But all parties were already legally obligated to do that. So again, it didn't seem to me to represent an enormous change. Finally, I was aware of legislative efforts to cut down on anti-Israel boycotts. And some of those had repercussions for free speech on campus. I went to speak in Texas some years back, and I actually had to sign something saying that my company, which is just the enterprise, was not engaged in the boycott of Israel. But I was not engaged in the boycott, and I like money, so I have to sign. But I did wonder about people who were engaged in Israel boycotts. And I did learn that at least one figure who tried to come to, it was not Texas, a different state with a similar requirement, refused to sign and was disinvited, was unable to come. So I knew about all of those things, but again, they seem to me to be more exceptions to the general rule that there was considerable legislative deference to academic freedom. I'm not sure if I was right about that. I mean, maybe I was wrong even at the time, but boy, is that ever not true now. And I'm just going to home in on two areas. One is the divisive concepts legislation, and the other is legislation concerning tenure, which I mentioned at the beginning. I hope we'll let you keep this. We'll see how it goes in the state of Alabama. Academic freedom, as it's been understood for a century or so in the United States, means among a lot of other things. I'm quoting from an old document. The university teacher in giving instruction on controversial matters is under no obligation to hide his own opinion. So, for example, let's say I am an economist, which I'm not. I like to imagine. Let's say I've done some work on the minimum wage, right? Or you can just give the matter a lot of thought as an economist. According to this idea, I don't need to hide my view from students, whether that view points in a liberal direction, conservative direction, or doesn't point to either direction. I don't have to hide it. The standards of our profession suggest only that when dealing with controversial matters, I should, in addition to saying what I think, if I choose to do that, set forth justly without suppression the divergent opinions of other investigators. That's the code, right? Not legally enforceable, but sort of part of the prophecy of professional ethics. Now, in contrast, what Florida law now says is that professors may not advance, that's a quote, a sort of divisive concepts, also quote, in the classroom, which might include, on my reading, which is not very controversial, arguments in favor of affirmative action. One of the concepts is, I'm quoting from the Individual Freedom Act, also known as the Stop Woke Act. A divisive concept is to say that members of one race, color, sex, or national origin cannot and should not consider others without respect to race, color, sex, or national origin. Right? That's a bit of a word salad, but what it's basically saying is a divisive concept to say that we really ought to be considering race or national origin in dealing with certain kinds of issues and problems. That's the divisive concept, which one is not supposed to advance in a classroom, or maybe under some other circumstances too, in Florida law. So what does that mean? It means that if I advance in a classroom the view that affirmative action is a sound policy, even if I'm an expert on affirmative action, even if I have researched it carefully, I've come by my conclusions honestly, even if I acquaint students with the opinions of other people who don't think that affirmative action is a sound policy, I've probably violated the Stop Woke Act. Similarly, if I argue that paying reparations, right, whether for slavery in the United States or for the Holocaust in Germany is good policy, I may be advancing a divisive concept that an individual by virtue of his national origin bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by others of the same national origin. It would seem that any kind of reparations argument, right, advanced, whatever on earth that means, would violate the Stop Woke Act. The law is written in such a way that even if Dr. Rose invites a guest speaker in, and he's in Florida somehow, who advances such a concept, that's probably a violation of the Stop Woke Act. Now, the law is written in such a way as to suggest that discussion of divisive concepts will still be permitted. Right? The law says that. But it insists in roughly the same way that one cannot endorse such concepts. So in the earlier part of the law, you can't advance it. In this discussion portions, you can't endorse it. Now, what does that mean? Well, university lawyers have kind of scratched their heads a bit, and they say, yeah, we don't really know. But in the meantime, better be careful. The University of South Florida suggests that someone asked my opinion about one of the forbidden topics, and they wish I were joking. I would say my own conclusions, beliefs are not part of this discussion. Right? That's what's recommended. North Florida College suggests that even opening a class discussion might be dangerous. So it's best to say something like, and again, I'm not joking, this is recommended language, I'm going to open a discussion of this topic at this time. While such discussions are important to your education, the opinions of your fellow students do not reflect the opinions of the college. Right? Now, by the way, and I think this is important, you don't need to be careful about topics that are not deemed divisive under the law. So under the law, it appears that I could share my view if I were in Florida, my view that affirmative action is bad. I just can't share my view that it's good. I could share my view that reparations are bad, right? I could do that, but I can't share the view that they're good. And that tells you something, right? That the purpose of the law is not to promote objectivity. It's instead to beat back certain ideas. and supporters of the legislation, not enemies of it, who describe it as a stop woke. Right? They're quite upfront about this. There's a set of ideas that we need to, suppress. Last point about the Stop Woke Act, because violations can result in a dramatic loss of funding for universities that don't deal with them promptly. And because professors can be individually sued for violating the law, professors have incentive to avoid even coming near so-called divisive concepts, while universities have incentive to punish professors swiftly for perceived infractions, right? So that's a really, that's the chilliest of chilly facts. This Florida system serves 300,000 or so students and employs 60,000 or so faculty members, so the reach of this kind of legislation is a lot greater than the reach of a bad policy or incident you might read about happening at your law school. And the Florida model is being pursued in other places, right, including right here in Alabama, where a bill very similar to the Stop Woke Act has been introduced this legislative session. I don't know where it's at right now, but I know it was introduced. Divisive concept laws applying to public universities have also passed in other states, South Dakota, Mississippi, Idaho, and I think a couple of others. You got on the same model, so it's just not one state, right? It's an effort across numerous states in which you have legislatures that are dominated by the GOP. Now, I think the laws this time are eventually going to be struck down. The part of the Florida law I highlight that actually already been enjoyed is to stop from taking effect by a federal court, which thinks that it violates the First Amendment. Remember what I said before about academic freedom. That's in a lot of ways a set of voluntarily adopted rules, whereby governing boards, presidents, those responsible for governing colleges and universities restrain themselves from getting too involved in matters once thought passed up to faculty. Decisions about curriculum, about which faculty members are meeting professional standards, and about who should be hired and promoted. Increasingly, Republican legislators and governors, whether because they actually think that universities have been taken over by leftists, or because attacking universities plays well in public, are much more inclined not to micromanage hiring, promotion, and curricular decisions than they were before. To take one example, Governor DeSantis in Florida recently appointed new trustees for a small college, public college, called the New College of Florida. Their job is to turn it, and again, it's quite open. The Lieutenant Governor of Florida has said they want to turn it into a Hillsdale College of the South, where Hillsdale is a well-known conservative and Christian college in the state of Michigan. I expect he's within his legal rights to do that. That's not going to be struck down by that kind of management. Now, such moves are going to be made easier if the other legislative effort I mentioned before succeeds, the effort to eliminate or weaken tenure protections, thereby making it a lot easier to fire professors who are towing the line. In Florida, again, Governor DeSantis has suggested that presidents and boards will be required to take control of hiring and promotion without interference from faculty committees. Required to take control of hiring and promotion without interference from faculty committees. This is a major departure from academic freedom protection practices that have developed over more than a century in the United States. Right? This is not more of the same. It's a big deal. The law now under consideration actually doesn't do that, but there is a law under consideration that, though it doesn't require faculty committees to be shut out of the hiring process, does allow it. Right? So you can do a hire, and now if you do a hire, you have to put together a faculty committee. They make a recommendation. The president doesn't have to accept the recommendation. Usually a lot of deference is given to these kinds of recommendations. Now the idea is in the state of Florida, you want to hire somebody, you don't need a faculty committee. Who cares about what they think? What do they know? Right? About who's going to be good at teaching. There's also, instead of, sort of regular review, a lot of places have post-tenure review, you have to get tenure, maybe every year you have to say something about, here's why I didn't teach, maybe every few years, we'll do a more elaborate review. But in Florida, the idea is that professors can now, even if they have tenure, be reviewed at any time by the university's board of trustees at the request of the board chair. Right? Now in Texas, right, I don't want to talk only about Florida. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has made his intention of ending tenure really clear. And it's not because he thinks, right, the tenured professors are dead weight, or because he thinks that there are other and better ways of preserving academic freedom. I think there are legitimate arguments to make in criticism of tenure, but what Patrick has said is that he would like to define teaching critical race theory as a cause for a tenured professor to be dismissed. Critical race theory here being a catch-all for many ideas about race favored by left liberals. He said, again, this is him talking, it's not Emery's talking, he's not going to let loony Marxist professors voice the minds of young students. With critical race theory, we banned it in publicly funded K through 12, and we will ban it in publicly funded higher education. Right? So again, the intent isn't some, policy worries about, tenure, but again, the idea is we need to suppress this idea. He said he hopes his proposals get all these professors to go, like America, to leave the state, wishes to get rid of tenure so we can get rid of professors who espouse ideas that he and other Republicans do not like. Accordingly, the bill has been introduced in Texas Senate, which I think is quite likely to pass, which says that public universities can no longer offer tenure. Public universities can no longer offer tenure. So let me sum this part. First, GOP legislatures and governors are increasingly uninterested in preserving academic freedom. They pass some laws and propose others to prevent ideas they dislike or consider harmful from being taught in public college classrooms, and to the same end, they're busily leaking tenure protections and asserting control over hiring and promotion. It's not business as usual, but a major change in how public universities in some states operate, and it's a threat to academic freedom, I think, however one defines it. And it's not an issue exactly what academic freedom means, but I think on any definition, this represents a threat to academic freedom. And again, unlike the speaker of dissertation, it's just a real issue, right? So it's not students, right, who are doing this, student faculty members who might join the students in doing this. It's people with the power of the purse, right, the power of the law who are doing it. And that's one reason that of the theories we've discussed, many would argue this is the most important one. Right? Now you could argue instead that since trustees and legislators aren't actually sitting in a classroom, liberal professors, students, and staff are what you have to be most concerned about when you're thinking about the free speech atmosphere on campus. And you may see, I've heard many people say something like this, you may see legislative action is just the only way to set universities right, which would raise progressivism more and more openly under the heading of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think there is something to the idea that universities that take up politics are not in a great position to cry foul when politicians prefer that their politics, rather than the politics of faculty and staff, get promoted. Whatever you think of that argument, the result is that free speech on campus and academic freedom find themselves surrounded. Progressives on the inside, conservatives on the outside. Right? Nothing good going on if you think that one argument has more weight than the other. So I'm not sure if all this amounts to a free speech crisis at our colleges and universities, but I'm pretty sure it ain't good. That's a significant problem. One more part, brief. Free speech is not enough. I said I'd conclude by considering why free speech all by itself isn't enough. Colleges and universities work at their missions. So let me say a little something about this. David French, who used to lead FIRE, says that free speech advocates have rolled back severely speech limiting codes on campus. And that's true. There were restrictive speech codes in the 1990s, and gradually most of them, in public places especially, but also at private universities, have been rolled back. The era of the speech code, he says, is over. Of course, it's the legislative speech code, which he is against. But French acknowledges, and I think it's true, that you can have campuses where speech is very well protected, where no one is agitating for speech to be suppressed, and where nonetheless there's a great reluctance to speak. Right? Anyone who's ever attended Thanksgiving dinner, right, is aware that if you don't need censors present, we're going to shut things down and prevent discussions from happening. Once you have the ability, right, the freedom to speak, you have to somehow or other be persuaded to pay the cost of speaking. Right? And there's always a cost associated with speaking, at least potentially, in having your opinion scrutinized, and creating tension, and having to listen to blowhards when you've kind of engaged in a discussion, maybe being ridiculed, maybe being despised. I mean, why should students pay that cost? Right? Those who defend the widest latitude for free speech on campus usually fall back into the work of political philosopher John Stuart Mill. This is the last slide. His argument goes something like this, right? People who rotten judges, who are one-sided beings, natural partisans, who mistake one part of the truth for the whole of it. And the only thing that saves us is that we're capable, especially collectively, of self-correction. But our one-sidedness can only be corrected by exposure to every variety of opinion, a way of looking at things. No wise man, Mill says, ever acquired wisdom in any mode but this. So whether you're a society looking to make progress or a university looking to cultivate judgment, we want to make sure that every variety of opinion is available. That's the argument why I have to have the widest latitude for speech and why everyone should want to pay the cost of free speech. But I'm not sure that argument is that persuasive. If we adopt Mill's position, the university becomes, at least outside the classroom, like a private park, right? We'll let Professor Deplorable speak under the oak tree, Professor Resistance speak under the elm, and we'll sort it out. Because truth, as Mill says, is often a question of reconciling and combining of opposites. But Mill didn't think it worked that easily. In fact, he anticipates that once you open up the discussion and people actually find out what other people think, they'll tend to often to become more, not less one-sided than they were before. The tendency of all opinions to become sectarian, says Mill, is not cured by the freest discussion. It is often heightened by the freest discussion. When I didn't know about the other opinion, I could ignore it, maybe, but now I reject it all the more violently because I see proclaimed by persons whom I regard as opponents who are probably bad people. So why does Mill think that's okay? In other words, why does he think that heating up in the way is okay? Well, he says it's not only impassioned partisan, it's on the calmer and more disinterested bystander that the collision of opinions works its effect. In other words, sure, if I invite an extremist to the left, an extremist from the right today, most of us will have a lot of foam coming out of our mouths, more foam than we did before. But as we're throwing food at each other and so on, somebody who's just passionate, maybe Dr. Gross, will kind of look on, flip over and say, oh, this is rather interesting. That doesn't seem like a brief for what we're doing at a college or university. That might be okay for a public park. We want at least to imagine that universities know how to shape the kind of common, more disinterested bystanders that Mill has in mind. The loud arguments we have about free speech on campus often skip the question of how to get students and frankly, faculty and staff as well, and a good place to judge speech. If they talk about education at all, it's either just happens automatically somehow by ushering into the presence of people who are yelling at each other from opposite sides, you'll get an education somehow as a result of just being made to listen to that. Or we teach students the First Amendment, they do that out of work. But nothing is said, or very little, about how to educate people who have some interest in listening and capacity to judge what they're hearing. Now, regrettably, time and my knowledge doesn't really say a lot either about this, but I want to say this. The calmer and more disinterested spectator Mill's talking about doesn't need to be entirely calm or wholly disinterested. What he needs to do is be part of what you can call an intellectual community, where we don't necessarily forgo all aims as individuals other than the pursuit of truth, right? Maybe we want to cure cancer, right? Or promote peace, or improve the economy, or develop our skills, right? We may not be pure species, truth seekers. But if we join this community, what we're agreeing to do is to hold ourselves, at least while we're participating in it, above the fray in this limited sense. Right? We agree that in conflicts between our personal convictions, the best arguments, evidence, the latter should prevail. We decide to pursue whatever goals we have. They may even be activist goals, but we're going to pursue them by following the arguments and evidence where they lead. We mostly don't do very well at this, but that's the idea. The political philosopher John Watkins, whose thoughts concerning education, says there cannot be anything so misrecombinant or inappropriate. Anyone who pretends to be a rational preacher has not to be able to plain reason and the conviction of clear arguments. The person who tries to follow the arguments and evidence where they lead may not turn out to be a free speech warrior, right? They actually prefer European-style hate speech codes, for example. But she is likely to know the value of speech in a way that she wouldn't otherwise. And as a seeker of the best arguments and evidence, she has a strong motive for separating the sages from the frauds. In the marketplace of ideas, as we say, she's most likely to be a smart shot. When we cry out in frustration, our Thanksgiving dinner political friendly, be reasonable, if we're feeling nice. We don't mean vote up on your skills, right? We mean something more like stop playing around or trying to win or serving your party or selling your wares and consider as if it really matters what conclusions, if any, we can draw from what we know. Free speech on campus is unlikely to do us much good, at least with respect to the pursuit of the truth, if we don't hold professors students and staff to be reasonable in something like this. Thanks. Thank you. Any questions?
I haven't always the question. It's not rolling one. So I'm Heidi Dempsey. In psychology, and I was just wondering with the Florida situation, does advocating include like presenting data? Like if you were presenting a study that says, you know, this is the results for Black participants and this, results for the white participants would show one race is better than the other or something on a task. Is that included in advocating as part of that? Like, could you not?
We wrote that. Right, and that's part of the point of writing laws that are vague and relatively broad in scope, right? You don't know when you violate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Students. I was curious about your government's speech, maybe under the guise of national security.
Yeah, well, despite the fact that I've developed most of my best answers by TikTok. I actually hadn't considered that matter a lot of thought. I mean, I do think that, there's a fight in Congress over whether the government ought to do that. There doesn't seem to be much of a fight over whether they can. But I don't know enough about the topic.
Thanks for coming tonight. Welcome to Jacksonville City. Do you think that this issue is compounded by a lack of understanding between free speech and freedom of expression?
Well, and you do think there's a distinction, right? That people used to make it a little bit more, right? Where speech potentially stands in for something different from, say a cry of pain, right? Or something like that. So speech occupies a special place, you might say, in terms of protection. But I don't think the issues we're having right now have a ton to do with that. And let me explain a little bit about why. I mean, first of all, the people who regard themselves as the biggest free speech warriors, right, aren't particularly set on simply preserving speech. They're also concerned about things like the arts. So, for example, in Idaho, as a result of a law they have concerning abortion in that state right now, a state university said that they couldn't have an art exhibit, right, that might be thought to transcend a certain kind of opinion about abortion. That would seem to sit in the mode of expression. But at the same time, it seems to be worrying in the same way. That's something that is more obvious in speech. So I don't think that the erosion of that distinction, such as people do talk about free speech and freedom of expression almost synonymously now. I don't think that erosion has much to do with the problems we're encountering on campus right now. What can you say why you think it might?
Well, I think that saying you're dumb.
What?
Yeah, I mean, right? An expression. I mean,
No,
there's
nothing
nothing to back it up. There's nothing, right? It's just an expression. Whereas, look, your policy on this or your supporting of this is wrong because of this, this, or this. It's much more speech. But the expression of I can say anything I want, anytime I want, to anybody I want, that's more expression. And I don't know that the founders really had that in mind when they were talking about speech.
Yeah, I see the distinction that you're making, and And there's no question that the understanding that we have of the scope of the First Amendment, although it's an understanding the Supreme Court now by and large has, that's relatively new, right? So the case I described, Snyder v. Phelps, I find it hard to imagine John Adams taking a look and saying, well, that's exactly what folks were trying to do with respect to the First Amendment. So I take that point, but at the same time, I think there's a reason for the erosion of that distinction because, if you're looking to protect political speech, right, which is a class of speech that may be used in the way that the kind of speech the First Amendment is most designed to protect. Speech on matters of political concern. Political speech is quite often really angry and doesn't contain an enormous amount of rational content. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist One, that defense of the Constitution, Federalist One, describes the character of what he sees as all great national public discussions. What he says is that when you have those discussions, a torrent of angry and malignant passions will be let loose. Right, so I think the concern with separating out speech that seems irrational and civil from speech that doesn't is that you would end up giving, right, if we're talking about the First Amendment, the government the power to suppress, right, in a way the bulk of what passes for political speech, not just now, right, in the 18th century. So I think there's some reason for being worried about making too fine a distinction between speech that's passable will cause rational merits protection, and speech that doesn't seem rational and doesn't. And also, it's also probably the case that sometimes when I get angry and I say something that doesn't seem to contain a lot of content, there's still a message. Right? When they have irrational content, there's a political message. And our capacity to send political messages would seem to be something you wouldn't want government to be too involved in suppressing, right? Especially if the people in power suppressing the opposition party because the message doesn't seem quite rational.
Yeah, thank you for that. One question that comes to mind is you started with these different kinds of codes of conduct universities. You talked briefly about the 90s, about these speech codes that have largely died away. And you sort of ended by saying free speech isn't enough. So what would you like to see? What do you think would be more productive in terms of how campuses, it's kind of a question around like community, and community is being different at different levels or operating at different scales. You have like the national community, the guy at the public park who I don't have to associate with. I don't live around, right? I can sort of tolerate that or not and just kind of go on my own. But universities are communities often where students live together, they eat together, they are in classrooms together and things like that. So what is like the right balance, I guess, maybe in your mind as someone who studied this, about how universities should navigate these sort of turbulent issues?
Yeah, and the first thing I'd say is that, there's no perfect way to navigate these issues, right? I mean, there's no solution that's going to get to the point, well, now there's not going to be a blow, right? That's all. So we have to think about what might make things a little bit better. I mean, I start at the level of the individual classroom. I just want to begin there and I'll try to scope it out. And I think I would go back to what I said about the value of speech, right? Seeing what its value is. I think that a lot of us, again, not just students, right, our primary experience of speech, especially contentious speech, is pundits yelling at each other in order to get more followers, or in order to get a larger audience, but somehow or another to advance their careers, or alternatively, political spokespeople trying to do everything they can to make sure that their candidate is damaged in some way, like what they say. And this is kind of what a lot of speech looks like. You kind of look around you, and you see that kind of speech, you might wonder, well, why would I want to engage in that? That's terrible. So you're not likely to be too particular, right, about things like speech protections. I was talking to some students about this in Dr. Gross's class, and I think that one mistake that professors of a free speech cast will sometimes make is finding bizarre that students don't come in already in love with the First Amendment. I mean, why would you be? I mean, it's hardly obvious for the reasons this gentleman just mentioned that, most of the speech you hear has any value whatsoever. So I think in individual classroom, right, you actually have to show the payoff, so to speak. That is to say that there is a way of discussing issues about which reasonable people disagree that isn't reducible to, you've got your opinion, I've got mine, so let us yell at each other. Right? That there's some way in which it's possible to make progress with respect to those kinds of issues. Because I think once you see it's possible to make some kind of progress, even if you're not at a 100% right answer to it, then you begin to value speech, which helps on both sides, right? That's to say, now I'm a bit more tolerant if somebody maybe crosses the line of things, right? Because I value the discussion, but also as a speaker, I'm a bit less likely, right, to say things that are going to shut somebody out of the conversation because I value the conversation more now. So I think in an individual classroom, the most important thing to do is to show that there's some value to this conversation. That's sort of done by demonstrating. Just do the best you can. It doesn't always work. That's what you have to try. And then as a university, I think that spirit in the classroom, you have to try to scope it out. So in orientation or in events like this, or in terms of the kinds of other public events you might have, you take a lot of opportunities to try to demonstrate this kind of thing, right? I think faculty aren't very good at this, frankly. So I think the way in which faculty try to make policy, like, should honor conversation. Right? I've never been to a faculty meeting, I think, the last been to many of them, which I've seen anybody actually persuade somebody of something. That's actually functioned very much. So I think that sort of across the college and university it's enormously difficult. I mean, I think it's an immense challenge actually to learn something. That makes our task, really hard, which means that you have to sort of go at it, to use the analogy I'm not really entitled to, on all cylinders, right? So again, orientation, how the president speaks, what your regulations are concerning speech on campus, what you tell students about public events, why you have them, what behavior is acceptable, what isn't. And then finally, the point you made about living together, right? I'm of two minds about that. And the first one is that we have this problem outside of campus too, right? There's my neighbor over there to the left, who maybe is flying the Confederate flag. Right? Now, I don't have to see him every day, maybe I'm going to run into that in the yard, and maybe he's at the school board meeting. Right? So if I'm actually an active citizen in some way, in fact, I probably can't avoid such people as I might avoid them if I run through the public park and try to avoid the people who are saying disturbing things, who are trying to sell me drugs, and rush through there, but I found my neighbors to be. And the people that I encounter in church or synagogue, the organization, and the co-workers and all the rest of that. So I think it's probably a mistake to suggest to students that here you're living with somebody. You're not going to have to tolerate, right, something that you may find really very deeply offensive. At the same time, I think it's not unreasonable to make a distinction between what goes on in a residence hall, what goes on in a space like this, what goes on in the classroom is quite different from what goes on in a public park, right? What goes on out there in the quad. These are all reasonable distinctions to make. So I think that you can have, and I think you can do this and still actually be within the full scope, right, of the First Amendment. You can say that in residence halls, we'll have rules about what you can post. And they'll have to be viewpoint neutral in some way, right? I can't say you can't post for Trump and you can't post for somebody else, right? But I can make viewpoint neutral rules about postings within residence halls to take into account if there's something special about where you live, right? So I think you can make some distinctions. That's a long answer.
Maybe I can bring a little bit of humor and curiosity into this. In the news this week, we have those individuals who are asking for a 6-month pause in AI chatbot development for fear of civilization being at risk. So if we were to try to imagine 5 years from now, some AI chatbots saying some things that were hurtful, perceived as hurtful to other people, and the programmers didn't know why their chatbots behave like this. I mean, are we headed towards a time when maybe AI chatbots will be censoring and watching other AI chatbots?
I'm gonna give you a 3-word answer to that, which is, I go with that. I should, like I said, I was the one who, this is a real thing that happened. I was with a friend at the first Starbucks opened in New York, and I said, this place is never gonna go anywhere. So, I try not to make predictions, especially about the future. And I have used, ChatGPT a little bit. I think the thing that I find that my son says it's best actually for coding problems. But I find it good as kind of an absurd advice columnist. So you can ask it anything. Perspective, I still spit out some kind of questions. But in terms of we do have to confront technological changes when we're thinking about speech. And one of the problems we're certainly having about speech right now has to do with the character of the public internet forum, I guess that's called it, and its character, just as you had special problems arising with respect to how we can talk to each other after the advent of the printing press, right? This is an old problem, right? We're always getting, well, not always, but often getting new tech, and then we have to figure out how we're going to do it from a free speech perspective. A lot of sort of free speech borders. There's a lovely history of free speech written by a guy named Jacob Hangama, right? Who takes very seriously, right, the special problems that social media presents, both in terms of the character of speech, but also the capacities of large companies, right, to control speech. But he basically says that the same rough principles, right, of free speech that one might have advocated prior to this technology still work, right? You have to adjust tactics and strategy, but the basic principles are going to be more or less the same. So those AIs who are monitoring other AIs, right? The basis for their monitoring might not look a lot different from the principles that we associate with free speech now, or alternatively, principles we associate with that should be restrained and suppressed.
Under these stop work acts in Florida and Texas, it's clear what is deemed a divisive subject. It's pretty vague. As a student myself, I've gained the most in my college experience through discussing a lot of topics outside of the class through my peers, professors. Do you guys see these stop work acts targeting the interpersonal connections and relationships between students and professors that they may, form through the 4 years, 6 years someone is in college with? Because what necessarily is deemed a divisive subject is so vague that anything could be thrown into that, and someone could be fired for simply talking to a student.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's real danger of that kind of thing. It's not just legislation either, right? I mean, it's a broad atmosphere in which you fear, right? In Florida, because of legislation, other places because of what somebody might say about you on Facebook or the internet, or perhaps somebody's taping your class, right? You have to worry about is it going to be broadcast, right? Happens to be younger. So you could be worried about the law. You could be worried about being fired at a private university once maybe some misleading snippet of what you said gets transmitted, and the cost of transmitting snippets is very low. I mean, it's always been the case, right? That if I told a student something, they could, write to the newspaper, talk to somebody, and report what I said. But now it's just so easy, right? The cost of, right, the cost of putting derogatory, misleading information about somebody out there is so low. I'm no economist, but I think when the price is that low, you're getting a lot more of it. So I think there are a lot of professors who are operating in an atmosphere where they think, better not risk it. But I think that does affect interpersonal relationships. Makes it a little bit harder to be a teacher to a student.
Been hitting, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but probably classes on it. You've been hitting on some of this, but I wanted to see if you could share your thoughts on where do you think the issue of self-censorship is going? And by that, I mean faculty who are perhaps afraid to have a class discussion on immigration policy, because the dialogue that might occur, or from the student standpoint, engaging in that dialogue on that topic, fearful of retribution if policy may be different from that of the professor. So, I mean, I see self-censorship coming from, various sides. I was just wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's a big issue that I didn't touch on very much in this talk, but I do have some views about it. I think it's one of these issues, again, where we don't know as much as we'd like to know about it. So, sometimes you'll see survey data presented about the way in which, now I'll talk about students, I'll come back to faculty in a little bit, the way in which students might feel really uncomfortable about talking about certain things in class. So, for example, there's a group called the Heterodox Academy that does a campus expression survey. They've been doing it for some time now. And they ask some questions like, if a controversial issue concerning, say, race, they ask about gender, they ask about politics, they ask about religion, would you feel very comfortable talking about it, somewhat comfortable talking about it, somewhat uncomfortable talking about it, or very comfortable talking about it? And what you find when you read those surveys is that there are quite a few people who feel pretty uncomfortable about talking about those topics, right? But the question is, what does that mean? Right? They say, who doesn't feel uncomfortable talking about a lot of those topics? What should the number be? Exactly, what do you expect? So I was actually quite surprised, I was looking at, they broke down the data that it's not a huge group, so it's a bit hard to draw conclusions about the subgroups, but they looked at, well, if you were liberal, how do you feel comfortable or uncomfortable about this or that subject? If you're conservative, and so I was looking to see, well, how many conservatives feel very uncomfortable talking about race in the classroom? And again, if you read it out loud like Campus Reform, that number should be 182%. Right? But it's actually more like 12% or something like that. Now, there are a lot more who are somewhat uncomfortable. As a professor, I can work with someone uncomfortable. I'm someone uncomfortable talking about most anything. And lots of my students are too. You know how as a moderator can people somewhat uncomfortable maybe to get out of the conversation. What you're most worried about, I think, are when the numbers of people who are very uncomfortable about talking about a topic creep up. We also have all kinds of data about what non-students say. You ask them things like, well, how many times have you wanted to say something in the past year and you haven't said it? Right? Does that happen often, sometimes, whatever? And again, it's hard to answer mean because, again, what's the right number? Right? I mean, who hasn't suppressed something they want to say, especially when you're talking on the scope of year, it's hard to know. Right? So it's very difficult to get to the bottom of these numbers. I think these surveys need to be supplemented more than they are by focus groups where you actually talk to people, who did the surveys and get some sense of, what exactly they're uncomfortable talking about, why they're uncomfortable, although they do ask that question in a broad survey way. Paradox Academy, usually it's their fellow students they're most concerned about the peer group, not surprisingly. You need to have a lot of follow-up questions to find out what exactly is going on and whether it's all that worrisome. But I will say, just on an anecdotal basis, I just think there's no question that there are faculty members who think, I am just not going to touch this topic. It is not worth it. I am not going to teach this book. It is not worth it. And so despite my doubts about the survey data, I think there's no question that there's some of that going on. I just don't know much. Right, but there's no question in my mind some of that goes on. And I myself have sometimes decided I have just smorgasbord of topics to choose from. Right, and I think, any one of them will sort of serve my purpose, and then I'm gonna choose the one where I don't think, right, that I'm going to wind up on Twitter or YouTube or Facebook or whatever, so, or one of my students might for saying the wrong thing in my classroom. So, I myself am at least somewhat careful, and I may still teach on controversial issues. I've been doing a course in basically civil discourse right now, and we're doing the abortion issue just a year or so after Dobbs. I expect that'll be contentious. We did cancel culture. I expect that'll be pretty contentious. We're going to end with anti-racism and critical race theory, which is very contentious right now. So we'll see how it goes. So I think professors are still doing stuff like that, but at the same time, I think that they're taking care of, not always for good reasons. These are people who are taking care of it because they think, well, if I reveal my scientific racism in class, well, I get in trouble. There's more people who are thinking, if I touch this topic in my classroom, there might be an explosion I'm going to find hard to control, and somebody might end up bad shape as a result, or perhaps me.
All right, so I'm going to break your number one rule and ask you about the future. Just be prepared for that. Do you think there will ever be a time in the future at some point where there may be a universal policy or map for what is clearly allowed and not allowed in terms of like civil discourse? Or do you think it's going to remain basically how it is, like Florida, for example, like we've been talking about? Florida says this is what we believe. People outside of Florida say, no, this is what we believe, and it'll be more region and population based as opposed to a universal. This is what we as a American society think is allowed and not allowed.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could. I want to give two answers to that question. Hopefully, they will contradict each other. The first one I want to give is that there is already a national standard. That's why the Stop Woke Act has already been enjoined by a federal district court, right? Because they seem to say that this is not allowed, and nationally we think actually it is allowed. And you state governments via the 14th Amendment, you're subject to the First Amendment, and so you actually can't pass this law. It's too vague, right? It's not clear what it means. So there is a national standard, but the national standard nonetheless, right? I think there's always going to be contention over what the borders are. So that there are, classifications of speech that we sort of know might be the kinds of things that are disallowed, defamation, harassment, discriminatory harassment. It's not much adoption anymore, but technically fighting words, right? But what precisely those things mean, right? That continues to be a matter of contention, in courtrooms and also in our common speech, right? That's why, for example, Snyder v. Phelps, that I talked about at the beginning, right? That is an H1 decision, a stage 1 decision, right? The court actually disagreed, right, about what ought to be allowed, and I expect that to continue. Even more so, I'd say, in the realm outside of the law, we're just talking among ourselves, right, about what it seems we might want at least be very careful about talking about, and what we should, shout as loud as we can in order to preserve, an open discourse. I just don't see that disagreement ending, at any time. I don't see how it possibly could. And this is really true of almost any general rule you set up. So, for example, we're pretty clear on another element of the First Amendment, right? That Congress can't make a law, stopping the free exercise of religion. Okay, well, what's a religion? Yeah, so that's always good. You can't draw up something so tight, right? But there's not going to be some dispute about it.
We have one question beyond my audience. So maybe end on that one here. We're almost at 7. What do you see as the future of free speech on campus and off campus?
It's a typical question I said when I talk about the future. Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, I think that, I mean, if I really had to make a prediction, I think that even the present Supreme Court is quite different from the previous Supreme Court. I suspect that they'll probably be like the previous courts in terms of, you know, having a really wide scope view of what type of speech is protected. I'd be very surprised, for example, if Tocqueville got up to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court said, actually, that's okay. Don't really surprise me, which means probably won't happen. So I think, you know, off campus, if you're talking about free speech as sort of defined in a legal way, I don't see that changing very much. You know, about the atmosphere of speech, and I just think that's very hard to say. I mean, I think a lot of the atmosphere we have right now, it has to do with, you know, for example, I know a lot of things, economic insecurity, a lot of blows taken, you know, one after the other. I was talking, you know, just as the university, right, took a tornado, right, and then took COVID and so on. So the country has taken a variety of blows, and that set us at odds in a variety of ways. And there's no reason to think that's going to last forever. Right? That's to say, I think it's always a mistake to project what's going on right now into the future. You know, so just a couple of other things on this. I think that there's something sort of episodic, you know, about real excitement about and concern about the suppression of speech, along with actual attempts to suppress speech. So, you know, in the 90s, there was the worry about political correctness, the same fight actually in the 90s over whether it was a real thing or whether people were kind of making it up. But it's the same kind of fight, and there certainly were efforts to suppress some speech on campuses, and that disappeared for a while, right? We weren't talking about that for probably over a decade, very much, you know, and then sort of reemerged. There is one, since I don't know about the future, I'll recommend a guy named Musa Al-Garbi, who is a sociologist, who sort of writes about these sort of up and down trends, and he thinks that the things we presently put under this unfortunate and hazy and hard to find umbrella of wokeness, he thinks that is already peaked, right? And so he thinks that the atmosphere with respect to at least that aspect of our contention over free speech, that's likely to get, I think maybe some other things will get attention, that particular aspect of it. He thinks that's peaked and is already on the decline. Now he makes arguments like, so for example, most of us, I'd say, became aware that there was an enormous issue, right, about, let's just say, politics on campus. Campuses were really riled up around 2015, right, because that was when all these protests, right, swept across a bunch of campuses in the country. And that's when journalists were really covered. But by Musa Al-Garbi, he says, well, actually, but if you take a closer look, well, it's getting a lot of national attention in 2015. What is going on, at least, you know, a couple of years before that. So, you know, the way we look at these trends, what we see in front of us by reading the newspaper, it doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening right now. Right? It may reflect our perception built on, you know, what was happening, you know, a couple of days ago, whatever. So, and I think there are some reasons to think that things will not look the same, right? In even 10 years, with respect to free speech, either on or off campus. But yeah, if we still have a country and everything in the world, but that things will look really different. But yeah, I just think it's very hard to say, you know, how. I mean, tell me how the next election is going to work out. Tell me whether Ron DeSantis ends up doing very well in national politics or gets spurred in national politics as well as towing these lines. I mean, there are political calculations here, right? Go along with whatever genuine belief you have, right? One of the reasons these legislatures are passing these laws is that they think they sell very well with their constituents. They might, but it's an important question, you know, how well is it going to turn out to sell nationally? And if it sells badly nationally, I think we're going to see less.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Marks again from Earth Science University. Yeah, you know, I got excited. The Cubs and the Mets both won today. So at least they didn't get out of the gate stumbling. Right?
What are those?
Thank you again very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Jack Miller Center, the Alabama Humanities Alliance for sponsoring the Tocqueville Lecture Series and this lecture. Truly none of this is possible without their support. We're looking forward to inviting everyone to join us again for another slate of lecturers during 2023-2024 academic year. But for now, please consider visiting the website about the free speech forum that we have in the fall through the American Democracy Project here at Jackson State University. For our online audience, and put a link in the chat. For those here in house, there are QR codes around the room. You can scan the website. You can submit questions for the forum right now and keep up to date for more information here coming for the fall forum. And we'll share information about that forum too through our Facebook page on the Tocqueville Lecture Series. Thank you again for joining us tonight throughout the year. And we hope you have a wonderful week. Good night.